When I was in high school, one of my best friends was an immigrant from the Arab country of Jordan. We played the same position in our school soccer team, and we became good friends through that. His family was Muslim, and I had no idea what that meant except for the unfortunate stereotypes in our culture today. So I remember distinctly asking him questions about Islam, and he would ask me questions about Christianity, and we would talk about the differences. For example, I would say, we believe in God. And he'd say, yeah, we believe in God too. I'd say, we attend church every week for worship. And he'd say, yeah, we attend the mosque every week for worship. Well, we pray and talk to God. We pray too. Well, we read and study the Bible as God's word. We read and study the Quran as God's word. We seek to love people and serve others. We seek to love people and serve others too. We were surprised to find that we had more in common than we thought. But it was when I brought up Jesus that our paths went in very different directions. I would say to him something like, we believe Jesus is God and that he's the way to salvation. And he'd say, yeah, that's where we disagree. We don't believe that. See, Jesus was the dividing line. Even though we both were faithful to our religions, which were similarly based on worship and belief and obedience to moral teachings, what we believed about Jesus made our respective religions very different. Why is that? Aren't all religions essentially the same? And didn't Jesus, after all, come to abolish religion? I mean, isn't being a Christian less about religion and more about a relationship? Those are very important questions that I want us to wrestle with today as we continue walking through the Gospel of Luke. We've already begun to see that in chapter 5, Jesus is causing some problems in first century Judaism. He's saying things you weren't supposed to say and doing things you weren't supposed to do. He's claiming to have the power to forgive sins. He's eating and drinking with sinners like tax collectors. He's not practicing the religion the way the Jewish leaders thought you should. All of this has brought him into conflict with the hallway monitors of first century Jewish life, a group of men called the Pharisees. They interpreted the law of God very strictly, adding thousands of man-made laws on top of God's laws. And there were so many laws that no one could possibly keep them all, even the Pharisees themselves. That's why they gained a reputation for being hypocrites. They maintained an appearance of being holy and high up, but they did not practice what they preached. And they spent much time judging those who didn't meet their standards. By the time we get to chapter 6, Jesus has already made the Pharisees concerned. They've begun to keep a close eye on him. They've complained and grumbled about him. But they haven't become infuriated just yet until our text today. Let's see why and what this story has to teach us about religion. Luke chapter 6, let's start in verses 1 through 5. On a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, that's Jesus, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." This is a story that requires some Old Testament background and also some first century Jewish culture background. Because at first glance, we might look at this and say, okay, what's the big deal here? Well, the big deal is found right in those first three words. Look again, it says, on a Sabbath. That's the setup and the key to this whole story. What Jesus and his disciples did would have been no big deal any other day of the week. They were not stealing someone's grain. The Old Testament law actually gave permission for people traveling to do exactly what they were doing. People passing by were allowed to help themselves to a small amount from someone else's field. The issue was they chose to do this on this day, set aside each week as the Sabbath. This is why the Pharisees responded as they did. Look at verse 2 again. Some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" According to the Pharisees, by doing what they did on the Sabbath, they were violating God's law, and that was a major no-no. If you remember our sermon series back in Exodus, we talked a lot about the Sabbath. The Sabbath was one day of every week from sundown Friday until sundown Saturday, in which no work was to be done. Instead, the day was to be set apart as holy to the Lord. So that was the weekly rhythm in the life of the Jewish people. Work 6 days and rest one day. And the Old Testament gave some basic guidelines on what that looked like, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. But the gist of it was, don't work, but stop and rest and worship. But that wasn't good enough for the Pharisees. Remember, these guys were known for adding laws on laws. They called these fence laws. Think of it like this. If breaking God's law was like crossing a line, then they decided that we need to build a fence 10 feet before you ever get to the line. That way, there's no chance that you could sin and break God's law. And on the surface, I could see how that makes sense. But the problem was these fence laws were endless. I mean, how close is too close to the line? Maybe we need to build another fence to keep us from the first fence, and then we need to build another fence to keep us from the second fence. So they started with the innocent question of, what does it mean to not work on the Sabbath? And they started making specific examples of what that would look like. They wanted people to know exactly when and how they would be in danger of violating this Sabbath command. So they made all sorts of extra rules, like if you carry this much weight on the Sabbath, if you walk this many steps on the Sabbath, then you were in violation. And they added so many rules and regulations that you can only imagine how difficult that day had become. Every week you had to think really hard about everything you did, lest you violate a rule. As a result, the Sabbath became more of a burden than a blessing, which was not the way God originally intended it. So according to God's law in the Old Testament, Jesus and his disciples were not violating the Sabbath. But according to the Pharisees' man-made additions to the law, they were. And that's what led to this confrontation. Look again at how Jesus responded. Verse 3 and 4. Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him?" Jesus says, "Have you not read?" And that was a really stinging insult because the Pharisees had read. They'd read it all many times. They had the Old Testament likely memorized, and they did not like it when Jesus said that, and we'll see him say it a lot. Jesus references here an Old Testament story about King David from 1 Samuel 21. David and his men were on the run from King Saul, who wanted to kill him, and they were tired and hungry. They're passing by the tabernacle, which was Israel's holy place, and so David goes in and asks the priest if they can have the bread of the presence to eat. What's the big deal there? Well, the bread of the presence was a special bread, freshly baked each Sabbath, and placed before the Lord in the tabernacle. It symbolized Israel's fellowship with God, and the only people who were allowed to eat it were the priests. And yet David, who wasn't a priest, he ate it. Then he gave it to some of his men who also weren't priests, and they ate it, and God didn't strike them down. Okay, neat story. So what does that have to do with Jesus and his disciples plucking grain on the Sabbath? Well, here's where it all comes together. Look at verse 5 again. Jesus said to them, here's the big one, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." You want to talk about a shocking and offensive thing to say to this group of Pharisees? This might take the cake. This would have put them over the edge, and it does. We've already seen the Sabbath was a big deal to these guys. It was their special day to demonstrate how much better they were than everyone else and to reign terror over people with their rules. They spent so much time writing about and talking about the importance of keeping the Sabbath. That was their thing. And Jesus just called himself the Lord of the Sabbath, meaning it's his day. He rules over it. He determines what may or may not happen on that day. That was a bold move. Not only that, but think back to the origin of the Sabbath. We think Sabbath, we think 10 Commandments, but the commandment is actually grounded in the very first Sabbath, which was instituted by God on the seventh day of creation. God created the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested and made it holy. And through that, God invented and instituted the Sabbath. So to say the Sabbath is my day, I'm the Lord of this day, to say that would be as clear a claim of divinity as any to this group of people. No one could say that but God. God was the Lord of the Sabbath. He created it. It was his day, and yet Jesus is right here claiming it for himself. And on top of all that, Jesus also called himself here the Son of Man. This was the most common way Jesus referred to himself, and this comes from the book of Daniel. It's a messianic title. Again, would have been very familiar to the Old Testament, these Jewish leaders and people. And this was the connection back to the story of King David. Jesus, as the Son of Man, as the Messiah, represented God's people, like King David once did. Jesus was the promised king to sit on the throne of David. So just as David had the authority to eat the bread reserved for the priest, Jesus was claiming the same kind of authority. He was saying that he determines what is lawful and what is unlawful on the Sabbath because he is the king, the ruler, the Lord of the Sabbath. When you put all this together, we see that in one sentence, Jesus dropped a metaphorical bomb. He was claiming to be the Messiah, claiming to be God, and he was claiming to be the boss of the most important holy day to the Jewish people, and they did not like that. So what did Jesus do? He took things further. He poked the bear again. Look at the next half of our passage, verses 6 through 11. On another Sabbath, he, that's Jesus, entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to him, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them all, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Here we go again. We're back at another Sabbath day, and Jesus is teaching again in the synagogue, and Pharisees are watching. They're waiting to try to catch Jesus violating some rule. And specifically, we see that there's a man with a withered hand, and they're watching to see if he would heal the man. Now, why would healing this man be wrong to do on the Sabbath? Again, this is one of the thousands of regulations that were placed on the Jewish people by the Pharisees. You were allowed to administer medical care to someone on the Sabbath only if they were dying. So if it wasn't emergent and you weren't on your deathbed, well, guess what? You got to wait till the next day. Otherwise, you'd be guilty of working and you would break the commandment. So according to them, this man with the withered hand, sorry about your luck, you're going to have to wait to be healed. But Jesus knew that whole setup was coming. He knew what they were thinking. He knew what they were trying to do, so he just deals with it head on. He says, "Hey, come on up here, man." He brings him up, and look at what he says to the Pharisees. He asks them all, he says, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to destroy it?" And this is really the crux of the matter right here. See, the Sabbath was a good gift from God, given for the good of people. It was meant to be a help, a blessing, a day of rest and restoration. It was a day to put God first, and by extension, to put others first. But the Pharisees had so distorted it that it had become harmful to God's people. It had become a burden, another impossible set of rules to keep. And the very fact that you couldn't help someone in need on the Sabbath, that was the exact opposite of what God intended. So the answer to Jesus' question was simple. It's lawful on the Sabbath to do good, to save life, to heal, and to help. But these so-called leaders were so deceived, they made it wrong to do good. So Jesus proved his point. He proved his authority by healing the man. And notice how he does it. Verse 10. After looking around at them, all he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. He heals the man by not even moving a muscle, so he doesn't actually do any physical work. He just uses his voice, the man's restored, and even in that, he's taken another little jab at the Pharisees. And this is when Jesus finally pushes them over the edge. Verse 11, they're filled with fury, and they discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. They finally realize that Jesus is a problem that must be dealt with. And eventually we know they will deal with him. So why did this issue over the Sabbath lead to the Pharisees' fury? And what does this have to do with us today? Well, what we see at the center of this conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees is a conflict over religion. Pharisees were very religious. They were religious in the negative sense of the word. They took what God originally gave to his people in the Old Testament and they distorted it. They made it all about rules and regulations and rituals. It was performative, external law that they valued. And they placed an impossible burden on people's backs. So we might conclude from these stories that Jesus came to abolish religion, to get rid of all the rules and practices, but that's not quite accurate. Jesus didn't exactly come to abolish religion. No, he came to recalibrate it, to realign it, to bring it back to God's original intention. You see, religion in and of itself is not a bad thing. Religion is simply a set of beliefs and practices in worship to God. That's the textbook definition. So to say that Christianity is not a religion but a relationship, it's not exactly true. And I know why we say that, because we want to emphasize that we're saved by grace through faith and we have a personal relationship with Christ, and that's completely true. That's not bad to say. But Christianity is indeed a religion. The difference is it's a true religion, whereas the Pharisees built a false religion. Jesus taught a good religion, a right religion, where the Pharisees taught a wrong religion. So what was the difference in their two approaches? After all, they both claimed to be working with the same material, the Old Testament. They both claimed to be Jewish. What made the religion that Jesus taught actually work? And what makes it different from every other religion in the world today? On the time we have left, let me show you two things real quick. Two things that we learn about true religion from these stories on the Sabbath. Here's the first. Number one, true religion embraces the supremacy of Jesus. The supremacy of Jesus. Stephen Prothero is a scholar on religion in America. He has written several books on the influence of religion, including one that came out in 2010 called God is Not One. This is not a Christian book. I don't even think the guy who wrote it is a Christian. But the introduction of this book would be worth the price in itself. The goal of the book is to challenge what's become a commonly held view that all religions are essentially the same. You'll hear that often in our culture today. People say, oh, all religions are just different paths up the same mountain. We all worship the same God. We're all going the same place. So let's just work together and get along. Come on. That's the popular mantra that we hear. So Prothero, the author, who again is not a Christian, he walks through the 8 largest religions in the world and concludes that is completely false. Listen to what he says. He says, religious folk worldwide agree that something has gone awry. They part company, however, when it comes to stating just what has gone wrong. And they diverge sharply when they move from diagnosing the human problem to prescribing how to solve it. Christians see sin as the problem and salvation from sin as the religious goal. Buddhists see suffering as the problem and liberation from suffering as the religious goal. If practitioners of the world's religions are all mountain climbers, then they are on very different mountains, climbing very different peaks, and using very different tools and techniques in their ascent. To say that all religions are basically the same is simply untrue. As my Muslim friend and I discovered, that the major religions of the world have some things in common, but at their core, they are very different. And that means logically, they can't all be right. They can't all end up in the same place because they're going in different directions. And it's not loving or tolerant to pretend otherwise. So what is the big difference between what we believe as Christians and every other religion in the world? We could spend a lot of time here and talk about a lot of things, but I think it's actually quite simple. At the end of the day, the difference is Jesus. Jesus claims something that none of the other religious leaders in history have claimed. He claims something bigger, something more controversial than Muhammad or Buddha or Gandhi or anyone. He claimed to be God and to be Lord over all creation. And that's ultimately what he meant when he said the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Pharisees, they got it. They understood very clearly what he was saying. That's why they began plotting to kill him. And ultimately they did, because Jesus claimed to be God himself. And by saying that, he also claimed what we call exclusivity. That means that Jesus is the exclusive or only way to God. That means every other religion in the world may say they believe in God, they may claim to worship God, but unless they come to him through Jesus, they do not know him, and their religion is false. Look, I know that can sound so arrogant and judgmental, especially to people who aren't Christians. I mean, how dare you say that Jesus is the only way to heaven and that everyone else is going to hell? How cruel could you be? How could you be so egotistical to think that you're the only one who's right and everyone else is just wrong? I remember having this very conversation with my Muslim friend. I'll never forget. He told me, he said, look, you're a Christian because you were born in America and you were raised to be a Christian. I'm a Muslim because I was born in the Middle East and I was raised to be a Muslim. I said, I know, I get that, but we can't both be right. And he said, I guess one day we'll find out which one of us it is then. And that's a difficult conversation to have with people. It's not fun to think that millions and millions of people could be deceived in their sincerest religious beliefs. We don't say that with pride, but with broken hearts and compassion for people. But guys, listen to me. What matters most at the end of the day is what is true. It's what is true. If Jesus is indeed the only way, then it would actually be cruel and arrogant to say otherwise. It would be dishonest. It would be actually harmful. It would actually damn people to lie and say that all religions are essentially the same. Jesus himself, the most loving person to ever live, he made it clear in John 14:6. He said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He says this over and over. He proclaims himself to be the only legitimate way to know God the Father. Now, a skeptic might say, okay, maybe Jesus did teach that. Maybe he said that. Maybe he believes he was the only way, but how do we know he was telling the truth? How do we know what he was saying was any better than anyone else? How do we know his religion is the true one? And this is where I always tell people it comes down to one big thing. And that's the resurrection. One of the big reasons Jesus rose from the dead was to prove that he truly is the way to God, that everything he said about himself was true. So listen to me, if you're here this morning and you're struggling with the idea of all these different religions and belief systems and what's right and what's true and how can we know that we know that we know, listen, first off, I want you to know we're so glad you're here. But I want to encourage you to study the resurrection. All you need is to answer one question. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? If he did, then it becomes much harder, if not impossible, to miss his supremacy and exclusivity. If he didn't, then all this is bunk. This is what makes Christianity true and different from every other religion in the world. Our religion is not built on a set of rules or rituals or practices. It's built on a person, the person of Jesus, who is God in the flesh. He is the center of it all, and it all revolves around him. So what does this mean for us as Christians today? This means that we need to make sure that we make Jesus and his gospel the main thing. Anytime we allow something else, even a good something else, to become the main thing, we become Pharisees. And we begin to adopt and promote a false religion. For example, serving those in need is a huge part of what it means to be a Christian. Just as it's also a big part of every other religion in the world, that we're called to love and serve the poor and the needy. And to not do so, Jesus said, is to be disobedient to him. But serving the poor and the needy is not the main thing. And if it takes the place of Jesus and the gospel, then it becomes a false religion. If serving the needy is the main thing, then we don't need Jesus. We don't need the gospel. We just need to go out and help people. So what makes Christianity distinct is that, yes, we do serve the needy, but we do it because of Jesus and the gospel, which are the main thing. Let me give you another example. I believe strongly that we need to promote and protect the institution of the family in our society. That means opposing things like adultery and pornography and homosexuality and fatherlessness, and supporting things like adoption and foster care and alleviating childhood poverty. I think those are causes Christians should work for. But if any of those things become the main thing, our chief focus and our primary call to fight for and preserve the family, it becomes a false religion. Jesus and the gospel have to come first. That is our priority and our focus. And then it's downstream from that we find our reason for promoting and protecting the family, which again, I think we absolutely should do. So do you see what I'm saying? We've got to lay the right foundation. True religion embraces the supremacy of Jesus. It makes him the main thing, the Lord over all. He's the focus. He's the center. And if he's not there as a foundation, it all crumbles. But there's one more thing we see in this passage about true religion. That's number 2. True religion enacts the love of Jesus. The love of Jesus. Jesus demonstrates in these 2 Sabbath stories that any religion that keeps you from meeting the needs of others and loving other people is a false religion. His disciples were hungry on the Sabbath. A man needed healing on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees were so bent on their false religion that they put rules over people. But Jesus proved you don't have to forsake religion to do good to others. One of the criticisms of religion that you hear today, particularly with Islam and Christianity, is that if you look at history, religion has done more evil than good. That's what they say. And it's true that much violence and war and slavery has been done in the name of religion, even by professing Christians, and that should grieve us and caution us. But it should not deter us. Because religion rightly focused on Jesus and his gospel, where he is supreme, will lead to a love for others. In fact, according to Jesus in the New Testament, it has to. It has to lead to a love for others in order to be sincere. So for us as Christians today, we need to ask, does our religion, our beliefs, our practices lead us to love other people like Jesus? If not, we may be Pharisees. Are we more concerned with judging the world than reaching it? If so, we may be Pharisees. Do we use religion and beliefs as an excuse to not help those in need? If so, we may be Pharisees. When it comes to the word religion, it may never be one we feel comfortable using to describe our belief in Jesus, and that's okay. It's just a word. It may always have a negative connotation in our society, but here's the truth. Everyone has a religion. Even people who claim to be anti-religious, even people who claim to be atheists, they still have a set of beliefs and practices that guide their life. That's religion. The key is this. when everyone is going in different directions, proclaiming a different set of problems and proposing a different set of solutions, there can only be one right way to God. Only one true religion. And I believe with all my heart, and we as a church believe with all our hearts, that it's the one focused on Jesus as the only way of salvation. And the one that then lives that out to a watching world. That is what we believe is the only religion that works. Would you pray with me?